Hi, beautiful souls. My name is Sadhana, and welcome to my channel. Welcome to part 3 in a series of side-by-side comparisons of various reproductions of the Tarot de Marseille. Today, specifically, we're going to look at the pips, ace through 10 in the suit of swords in the CBD Tarot de Marseille by Yoav Ben-Dov, which is on the left. In the center is Patrick Valenza's Trionfi della. And on the right is the Tarot de by LePage. Let's begin with the aces. One of the first things I like to look at when an ace is being offered by a hand is which hand is offering the object. And in this case, we're looking at a sword, which is traditionally associated with the right hand, with masculine, solar energy, path of action, and so forth. And in 2 of these decks, the sword is being offered with the left hand, which makes perfect sense in the Trionfi della being based in lunar energy. But I'm wondering why LePage chose to offer the sword in the left hand. And for me, this definitely plays into a reading, looking at which objects are held in which hands. It could affect how I answer a question, or if a querent is looking for a path of action, it might affect how they act in response to the question that they're asking. It's also fascinating to look at the crowns and the markings and the shapes of the crowns and how the branches and the leaves are coming out of the crown and what shapes those make, because these shapes may be replicated in neighboring cards, and you might get some kind of a connection between the flow of this energy and whatever's happening in an adjacent card. I've also more recently been questioning the branches that appear to be cut by the Ace of Swords, and I'm wondering which card they come from, or perhaps in a certain reading it'll be apparent which branches are being cut. Like, to me, it looks like this sword has severed 2 branches. And well, in this deck they look like dragons or something, and the heads have fallen off the dragons. But in a more traditional deck, they definitely look like branches. And you can see where Patrick got his idea. If you look at an older deck like the Dodal, you can definitely see that these are plants, branches here. Anyway, just something I've been pondering, and what the relationship is between the Ace of Swords and the branches that are there. The other thing that sometimes I look at in an account is the drops of blood, or the leaves, or the yods, because numerologically, sometimes in other cards where you see these, it plays into the reading. So it's just really interesting to me. The 2 decks on the right follow a traditional Tarot de Marseille sword pattern, in that we have a single bowed sword on the outside of the 2 and the 3, and then 2 swords in the 4 and the 5, and then 3, 3, and then 4, 4, 4. And I realize you can't see the cards at the top right now. I'll move those closer in a few moments. And also in the columns, the left-hand columns, we have traditionally floral energy. So here in the 2, 4, 6, and 8, we have flowers in the center of the swords. In the Trionfi della, we have something other than swords. So we do have floral energy, and then he's included here a all-seeing eye and then blood in the 8. And in Lori's deck, we definitely have floral energy in the center of the 2, 4, 6, and then we have some kind of illuminating energy in the center of the 8. And then in the right-hand column, the solar energy, in all of the decks, we have an upward-facing sword through the bowed swords. So that's common to all of the decks. And then what's really interesting, and I'm just looking at Lori's beautiful deck, is she adds this layer of color. And it does add symbology and metaphor. And there's lots of ways to bring in the use of color in her deck into the reading. And perhaps that's one of the reasons she says that this is not a Tarot de Marseille, is because she has changed several things. So for example, in a traditional Tarot de Marseille, the numbers are on the sides of the swords, and usually the point of the V is facing in. In Patrick's deck, it's facing the other direction, and the Tarot de the numbers are beneath the swords, which is not traditional for the Tarot de Marseille. And one of the nice things about the creator sticking to these traditional patterns is that if in a reading sequential numbers do come up, like the 4 and the 5, for example, then that's something that can be brought into the reading as the complementary energy between these various pairs. And I do really like how Lori has balanced out the dark and the light in some of these complementary pairs. There's just so much that can be worked with. Let's have a look a little more closely at the 2s and the 3s. They're very similar, surprisingly. We have a circular pattern in the center of the 2s, and then 4 main leaves, features coming off. And then there are other ones too, but even those are surprisingly similar in all 3 of these decks. And then the odd numbers, we have something coming off of each side. Patrick chose a ribbon, but here we have branches in the CBD and flowers in the Tarot de Zohar. And perhaps Patrick Valenza and Lori LePage based their decks on the Conver Tarot de Marseille, because in the Dodal we don't have this embellishment on the 3 of Swords. And here are the 4s and the 5s. And I really like the Tarot de Zohar. I love that we can see the contrast inside the window of the bowed swords between the 4 and the 5, the light and the dark. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the 5 of Swords, there's no droplets of blood in the Trionfi della, which may speak to this card being more about thought, mind, communication, than the droplets of blood, which are the focus in some of the other sword cards, like in the 3. And if the creator was intending to bring in that heart connection, we have 6 droplets of blood, which may very well connect to the 6 points of the hexagram. And then in the 9, the sword is completely soaked with blood. And we also have 6 droplets of blood at the bottom, and then 5 at the top. So you people who love numerology can read whatever you want into that. In the 6s and the 7s, I really appreciate all the extra little additions in the Trionfi della and the Tarot de Zohar. It just helps me in reading the cards, and maybe that's why I go to these contemporary decks more often than the traditional decks. For example, the wings here bring in a connection to the Chariot, and just having them here, it's like, oh yeah, okay, don't forget, Sadhana, that the 7 in the minor arcana is often related to the Chariot. So perhaps, not always, but there might be some connection here. So that helps. And then there's no blood on this one. So this is the only odd sword that, other than the ace, that doesn't have blood on the sword. And that might be really important in the reading. This all-seeing eye here too is, well, I can just bring in so many connections, but I love having this here. And these 2 contrasting pairs are also really brilliant, and they're very, very full and busy. And I know that's one of the things in reading the Tarot de Marseille is that the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, there's not much there. It's pretty simple. It's wide open and clear and clean. And when we get higher up in the numbers, it gets really busy and crowded and chaotic. And already in the 6s and the 7s, we get that feeling in the Tarot de Zohar. And then we get to the busyness of the 8s and the 9s with the pairs of 4 swords on either side. And while I am practicing reading straight up Tarot de Marseille, and I know that these exercises that I'm doing are going to make me a better reader, I also know that I will come back again and again to Lori LePage's deck. I love it so much. The use of color is absolutely brilliant. And I don't know if you see this or you've worked with this before, but we have the white here. We have the light. This is an 8 right? This is a number of harmony. And she's included the blue here in this bow, and this bow is pretty much all red. And we see that connection of the blue or the green, if you will, and the red. This huge open space and all this potential that's lying within the center. And even in this dark, very busy and crowded Nine of Swords here, if you look closely, there's all these little details. And one of those little details may emerge, or it may be pertinent to a certain question. And I know that's not how you read straight up Tarot de Marseille, but I am an intuitive reader, and I love to work with numerology. I love to work with color and symbology. And I love it when querents ask straight up questions. And sometimes certain things are going to jump off of certain cards. And I could just as easily get that from a more straight up Tarot de Marseille. But the odds are, for me, greater in working with a deck that has a greater variety of color and symbology. And lastly, let's have a look at the tens. We do have the crossed swords in the center of the pairs of fours in all of them. Here they are more crossed, and here they kind of disappear into the pattern. But the differences in these three tens is really quite something, and it's highly unlikely that I would come up with the same answer. Depends, of course, on the surrounding cards, but because they're so very different. In the traditional or more traditional Tarot de Marseille, the swords usually are just touching on the end, and there's quite a bit of open space, and I see this shape almost pointing the way forward to the card above, if there is a card above. And in the Trionfi della Luna, it's like, thou shalt not pass, right? You're not getting through here. It's obviously, this is the end. It is over, finito. And very similarly in Laurie's deck, I mean, the only way thou shalt pass is if thou art Elastigirl or something, right? It's completely closed off, but you do get a sense of optimism through the use of color. There's a lot of yellow in this card and very little red. So it's really hard to compare these tens. I find this all so fascinating, and I love nerding out with tarot study. My experience with Tarot de Marseille began with contemporary interpretations, like the two you see on the right. And more recently, I've been collecting and studying and working with older, more classical decks, and I'll share more with you in future videos. This tarot journey that I'm on, I feel, will only help to inform and expand my repertoire as a reader and deepen my comfort level with numerology, with working with basic colors, and building and bringing in historical references. So please let me know if these reflections are useful to you, and I will make a similar video with the other three suits. Thank you very much for watching. Stay well, and namaste.